Somebody just bought 937,000 acres of America and worked hard to keep it quiet. No listing, no announcement, not even a leak. The largest land purchase in the country in over a decade stayed invisible for a month until a trade magazine dug it up. The buyer already owned the Rams, Arsenal, and more land than two American states combined. A purchase like that could pass for a rich man's hobby. But billionaires do not hide hobbies. And when a man with that kind of information goes quiet and starts buying dirt, the question is what he sees coming. Ask anyone in professional sports about Stan Kroenke, and they will describe the owner of the Los Angeles Rams, the Denver Nuggets, the Colorado Avalanche, and Arsenal Football Club, a sports empire valued around $20 billion. What almost nobody describes is the other portfolio, because Kroenke has spent 30 years making sure nobody looks at it. His own public relations staff call him Silent Stan, which gives a fair sense of how much work they get to do. In December, he closed on the Singleton Ranches in New Mexico. More than 937,000 deeded acres, bought off market from the heirs of Henry Singleton, the founder of Teledyne. There was no marketing campaign and no press release, and neither broker would say a word afterward. The deal stayed invisible until the land report revealed it at a land investment conference in Des Moines the following month. It pushed Kroenke past 2.7 million acres and made him the largest private landowner in America, ahead of the Emerson timber family at 2.44 million, John Malone at 2.2 million, and Ted Turner at 2 million. But the size of the deal is not the strange part. The strange part is that he has done this before, the same way, in the same silence. 9 years earlier, Kroenke bought the W.T. Wagoner Ranch in North Texas, 535,000 acres under a single fence, listed at $725 million. The Wagoner family had held that land since 1849, and in 167 years, it had never once changed hands. With the Singleton purchase, he has now been the buyer in 2 of the 3 largest ranch sales in American history. A man does not repeat a trade of that size out of nostalgia. And Kroenke is only the most visible name in a much wider pattern. Bill Gates holds around 275,000 acres and is the largest private owner of American farmland, held through his investment vehicle Cascade and planted with soybeans, corn, cotton, and the potatoes that end up as McDonald's French fries. Jeff Bezos holds 462,000 acres. The Department of Agriculture reports farmland values climbing 5.8% a year between 2019 and 2024. So the money is not sentimental, and the asset has a habit of ignoring panic. In 2008, while American equities lost more than a third of their value, average farmland values in the United States finished the year higher than they started it. The strange part is who is doing the buying. These are men whose fortunes were built on liquidity, on stocks and screens and markets that clear in milliseconds. And they are converting billions into the slowest, heaviest, least sellable asset on the planet. But this only looks like a new fashion to people who have not spent time in the archives. The pattern is older than the country these ranches sit in, and it shows up with the same mechanics every time a currency dies. The cleanest place to watch it work is Germany in 1923, the year money stopped being money. In the summer of 1921, a German government bond was still considered the safest thing a careful family could own. 2 years later, the mark had gone from a few hundred per dollar to 4.2 trillion per dollar, and the savings of the German middle class had been converted into kindling. Anyone holding paper claims, bonds, bank deposits, pensions, life insurance, lost close to everything. Savings that had represented a house in 1914 would not buy a newspaper by November 1923. But the losses were not evenly distributed, and the map of who kept what is very simple. Everything held on paper burned. The ground itself came through untouched, and so did the family standing on it. Landowners came out of the hyperinflation ahead through 2 mechanics. The first was debt. Mortgages on German estates were written in marks, and German law held that a mark was a mark, however little it bought. So families whose land had carried heavy mortgages for generations paid off the entire balance for what amounted to the price of breakfast. The debt evaporated while the fields stayed exactly where they were. The second mechanic was that a field keeps producing no matter what the central bank does. A hectare of potatoes was worth potatoes, and in Berlin in 1923, potatoes bought things that trillion-mark notes could not. By the end of that year, German lenders had given up on their own currency entirely and started writing loans denominated in rye. Not backed by rye, written in it, a debt of so many hundredweight of grain, repayable in grain or its market price. When the bankers themselves start counting in crops, the argument about which asset survived is over. But one man read the situation earlier than the bankers did, and he read it as an opportunity. The businessman Hugo Stinnes ran the playbook at industrial scale. He borrowed marks as aggressively as banks would lend them and spent the loans on coal mines, steel plants, hotels, paper mills, and newspapers. Then he repaid the banks in currency that had become confetti. By his death in 1924, he controlled a group of roughly 1,500 companies, and the German press called him the Inflationskönig, the inflation king, while the foreign press went further and called him the new Emperor of Germany. It was not meant as a compliment. He does not appear to have minded. Weimar is easy to file away as ancient history, but the same mechanics ran again, 78 years later, in a country that had done almost everything the textbooks recommended. Through the 1990s, Argentina pegged its peso 1-to-1 to the dollar, and for a decade the arrangement held. A peso in a Buenos Aires bank account was a dollar by law, and millions of families planned their lives around that sentence. Then, on December 1st, 2001, the government froze the banking system. The measure was called the corralito, the little corral, and it capped cash withdrawals at 250 pesos a week. People stood outside locked banks holding account statements that were suddenly just paper with numbers on it. That same month, the country defaulted on roughly $95 billion of sovereign debt, the largest default the world had seen at that point, and the presidency changed hands 5 times in 2 weeks. A few weeks later, the peg was abandoned, and deposits that had been dollars were forcibly converted into pesos at 1.4, while the market rate slid past 3.5. A family with $100,000 in the bank came out the other side with roughly a third of it, without ever making a single bad decision. But 300 kilometers outside the capital, the same months looked completely different. The Estancia families were not standing in any line, because their wealth was not sitting in an account waiting for a decree. It was standing in fields across the Pampas, priced in dollars, producing beef and grain that the world still wanted. The government froze every bank account in the nation. It did not attempt to freeze the countryside, mostly because nobody has ever figured out how. And when the peso collapsed, Argentine grain became some of the cheapest on earth. Exports surged, and the soy boom that followed made landowners considerably richer than they had been before the crisis. The corralito confiscated the savings of the people who had trusted the system. The people who owned dirt barely felt it. Argentina, at least, still had a functioning state. The third case shows what the pattern looks like when the banking system itself simply stops existing. Lebanon spent 2 decades as the Switzerland of the Middle East. The pound had been pegged at 1,507 to the dollar since 1997. The banks paid generous interest on dollar deposits, and the Lebanese middle class, including a vast diaspora, kept its life savings in Beirut. In October 2019, the banks closed for 2 weeks. When they reopened, dollar accounts were frozen in all but name. Depositors could withdraw only limited amounts, only in pounds, and only at artificial rates, and the trap dollars earned their own nickname, Lollars, trading at a fraction of face value. Over the next 3 years, the pound went from 1,507 per dollar to nearly 90,000. An entire social class was quietly expropriated without a single formal confiscation. The hole in the banking system was later estimated at more than $70 billion in a country whose entire yearly economic output had shrunk to a fraction of that number. But the money that escaped the trap went to a familiar place. Real estate transactions in Lebanon surged in 2020 as depositors raced to swap frozen bank checks for apartments and land. And developers accepted those checks at a discount because they owed debts to the very same banks. And the old landed families, the ones whose wealth had sat in property and foreign assets rather than Beirut deposit accounts, never entered the trap at all. 3 collapses, 3 continents, 1 surviving asset. So the interesting question stops being whether land protects capital. History has answered that one 3 times over. The question becomes how the biggest owners pull income out of land for a century without ever selling it. And that is the part the ranch photographs never show. The working model is King Ranch in South Texas, 825,000 acres assembled in the 1850s and still intact. The family learned early that a single deed contains many separable rights, and that each right can be leased to a different counterparty, while the land itself never moves. The surface runs cattle and crops. The subsurface has been leased to oil companies since crude was found there in the 1930s, and thousands of wells now pay royalties to a family that drills nothing. Hunting leases sell corporate clients the privilege of entering the property to shoot quail and nilgai, which means the family is paid for access rather than for anything that leaves the land. It is worth pausing on that ranch for a second, because King Ranch is also the place that bred the first officially recognized American cattle breed, the Santa Gertrudis, and that is the detail the documentaries usually lead with. Financially, it is a footnote. The leases are the business. And the newest lease on that ranch, signed only 2 years ago, is the strangest of them all. In 2024, a subsidiary of Occidental Petroleum leased around 106,000 acres of pore space, the rock formations deep underground, to store up to 3 billion tons of carbon dioxide. In the American West, though, the most valuable layer is increasingly the one nobody photographs, which is water. When Kroenke bought the Broken O Ranch in Montana in 2012, the property ranked as the largest private holder of water rights in the state. And in a region that gets drier every decade, those rights appreciate on their own schedule, regardless of what cattle or crops are doing above them. 1 deed, 4 separate income streams, and not a single acre sold. But leases only explain the income. They do not explain how the land survived 4 generations of heirs without being carved into pieces. And that is the harder trick. What holds it all together is just as deliberate. When Henrietta King died, her will did not divide the land among heirs. It incorporated the ranch in 1934 so that descendants inherit shares instead of acres. A shareholder who needs cash sells stock to relatives, and the pasture stays whole. That single legal move is the reason the property never fragmented across the roughly 60 descendants who own it today. And when the family itself needs liquidity, it borrows against the land rather than selling it, because a loan attaches to the title, while the title never leaves the family. Held long enough, the strategy even outruns the tax code, since land passed at death resets its taxable basis, and a lifetime of gains disappears on paper. But the cleanest proof that these mechanics work is the man who sold Kroenke the New Mexico ranches in the first place. Henry Singleton understood all of this. The Teledyne founder was one of the most respected capital allocators of his generation, a man Washington trusted as a trustee of Ronald Reagan's blind trust. Starting in the late 1980s, he bought New Mexico ranch land parcel by parcel, refusing to pay more than $55 to $70 an acre, and organized the properties the way he had organized Teledyne, as separate operations run by managers he mostly left alone. He never sold any of it. His family held the block for almost 40 years. In December, They sold it in one piece, quietly, to Stan Kroenke. Therefore, the sale is not just a transaction. It is one disciplined holder of land passing the position to another, and that is where this stops being history. Kroenke is a real estate developer by training who married into the Walton family and built 60 million square feet of shopping centers, a fortune born entirely inside the liquid economy. His teams have won a Super Bowl, an NBA title, and a Stanley Cup, and the land may still turn out to be his best-performing franchise. Because seen against Weimar, Buenos Aires, and Beirut, the December purchase stops looking like a rich man's hobby. It is water rights in a drying West, grazing and minerals under one title, an asset no bank can freeze, no decree can convert, and no central bank can print more of. Nobody outside his family office knows what he paid or what he plans, because he has never explained a purchase in his life. But the historical record explains it for him. The tell was never the purchase itself. It was the silence around it. Capital that positions itself after a crisis holds press conferences and demands rescue. Capital that positions itself before one buys quietly, off-market, through ranch brokers who know how to say nothing. In Germany, in Argentina, in Lebanon, the people who ended up owning the ground were the ones who acquired it while the money still worked. And they rarely announced it either. The wealthiest men in America are buying dirt in silence. Silence, in this asset class, is the signature. Subscribe. The Cipher has always existed. Now you know where to look.